Hello, Dr. Peprah and Noah. Um, as you know, my name is Donaldson Conserve. I'm an associate professor at the George Washington University in the Milken Institute School of Public Health. And I'm also the founder of the Black Male Professors Researchers Collective. And today we have the pleasure to interview Dr. Emmanuel Peprah with my co-interviewer, Noah Oladele. So please, Noah, introduce yourself before we pass it on to Dr. Peprah.
Thank you very much. My name is Noah Oladele. I'm a first-year Ph.D. student at the Media, Culture, and Communication programs at Steinhardt School, NYU. I'm primarily interested in local practices in Sub-Saharan Africa, and my research is based on how local practices are demonstrated within global social media. So quite interested in the Global South, or specifically Sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Noah. And Dr. Peprah?
Thank you, Dr. Donaldson. Thank you so much in terms of everything. I am an assistant professor at NYU School of Global Public Health. I run the IC lab, which stands for Implementing Evidence-Based Interventions. And our focus is usually in the areas of Sub-Saharan Africa, with some work in the US. Our three areas of work mainly are in sickle cell disease, HIV/AIDS, and maternal health, obstetric hemorrhage. And we're starting to broaden out a little bit in terms of mental health, thinking about how really that impacts adopting evidence-based interventions within these settings. So first, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you. And I'm hoping that I can share some nuggets in terms of my particular journey, but I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, the implementation scientist in me is excited and wants to start with questions about implementation science and evidence-based interventions, but I know this is not the focus, at least not this part of the interview. So I would like to start by asking you to share a little bit about your journey. Where are you from? Where were you born and raised? And how did you eventually find your way into public health, Dr. Peprah?
Thank you. I was born in Ghana, West Africa, 1976, so a little bit over 46 years ago, 47 years ago. My parents immigrated to the United States in the 1980s. There was sort of a different environment in terms of it. My mother was a nurse. My dad had went to the University of Ghana and obtained his bachelor's in terms of African dance, believe it or not. So, and we came here and we landed in Texas first. That's where I had most of my primary education in terms of mostly elementary school, in high school, and then I went to school in terms of undergraduate at Texas A&M Commerce and East Texas University. And then after getting my bachelor's in science and biology, I taught for a couple of years as I worked on going to graduate school. Luckily, I was accepted into Meharry Medical College, a historically Black university, HBCU at Nashville, Tennessee. And I think it was one of the best decisions I made, going to an HBCU to get my Ph.D. And I'll talk a little bit further about that as this interview goes on. So from there, I did a postdoctoral fellowship in Atlanta at Emory University School of Medicine, had an opportunity to go to the National Institutes of Health, where I helped launch the H3 Africa project. I was there for almost 10 years. And then while I was there, I also was adjunct faculty at the University of Maryland Global Campus, and with the intent of thinking about coming back to academia. So there was a great opportunity in terms of NYU within the start and the launch of the School of Global Public Health. And I've been here since about 2018 or so, 5 years, and we're just doing some fantastic research in the implementation area, diseases that are near and dear to my heart, and we're just trying to advance sort of implementation, mentoring the next generation of folks that take after us. As you can see, I have a lot of grays in my beard, so eventually, I'm going to have to turn this over to some newer individuals who can lead this wondrous research on. So that's a high level overview of sort of my background.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We know exactly what questions to ask depending on which stage of your journey. So I'd like to pass it over to Noah in case he has any questions based on what you've shared so far. Oh, you're on mute, Noah. Sorry.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. I was very much interested in your experience in the HBCU school where you went to, because you said that that had a lot of impact in your academic career, I think. So I would like to hear if there was a specific experience that you had, or if there was a series of experiences you had that impacted your academic experience or your professional experience generally.
So I think the HBCU experience, I went to a majority institution for my undergrad, and I think the HBCU experience was just unique in terms of having lifelong friends and peers that I can always touch base with. Number one, it was a great and welcoming environment from my perspective, given that I was in a graduate school working on my Ph.D. So my dissertation was actually on African sleeping sickness. For those of you, there's not a lot of people doing work on African sleeping sickness, and I happened to be mentored by Dr. Manu Chaudhry, who I speak praises of, a short Indian woman who had a passion for doing research in terms of African trypanosomiasis and African sleeping sickness. As part of my dissertation, I actually went back to Ghana and did some local work at Noguchi and everything else. But overall, I felt that it was just a great environment in terms of nurturing me and allowing me to think beyond sort of what I could do, and giving me the wings to sort of move into the stage of my career, my professional career, and also giving me the confidence. I don't know, but I would say that during my tenure in graduate student, all the conferences that I went to, there weren't that many Black graduate students. Now there's been an increase in Black graduate students. The funny thing is, me and my peers would joke, after you've been to one conference, you basically know all the Black graduate students, and you'll see them the next year and the next year, and so forth and so on. But it was just a great experience. I have some lifelong friends that I still communicate with today based on that graduate experience. We've established a network, but it's just great to have people that you can talk to who understand your journey, because they're going through a similar journey in terms of their own career, whether it's in not only in academia, in government, or in industry. So that, I think, has been helpful in so many ways. Of course, we had a great number of instructors there at Meharry Medical College, but also just the lifelong friendship and everything else. And in terms of just the rigorous research that was done there. So I would say that to me, I think it was the best decision that I made, choosing to go to Meharry over any other school. So.
Thank you. Noah, do you have another question?
Yeah, I have a question, but I think if you want to go next, then probably I would go after you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just ask one question and then you can take it. So I'm actually interested in, how did you become interested in pursuing a PhD, and what helped you to be a competitive applicant for the PhD program that you ended up choosing?
That is a great question. I know that in my family, education has always been prized, right, in terms of it. I think that for me, when I left undergraduate and started teaching, I always wanted to go back to school and actually get another degree. The opportunity was afforded to think about not only maybe a master's degree, but maybe a PhD program. And as I started researching different PhD programs, there were some that wanted masters and some that were willing to accept you if you had good scores in terms of undergraduate. Meharry was one of those programs. So I thought about it, and I actually thought about, well, do I really need to expend this extra money to get a master's, or, and add more in terms of just my length of education, or go straight into a PhD program, knowing that, it could be a lot just as long or even longer in terms of it. So to me, I have to say that the choice was kind of made for me in terms of the programs that I was accepted into, but Meharry stood out as one of the better programs in terms of meeting the interest of what I had at that time, which being from Africa was global health. So global health has sort of been the through line through all of my career. So in terms of the work that they were doing there was quite interesting to me. Plus, I had also visited the school prior, a couple of years prior to my application. So I kind of understood the campus and everything else. So to me, it was just at that time a non-brainer at this point when I actually got the admissions I got accepted to Meharry Medical College.
Thank you. Thank you. Noah, please go ahead with your question.
All right, yeah, sure. So I had my master's degree at the University of Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I realized during my program was that the methodologies that were being taught, the syllabi itself, were highly Western. And what I decided to do was to bring my own experience into the classroom and into my writing. So I was always writing from the point of, from the African perspective and from my own personal experiences. I realized that most of your work, the bulk of your work, is based back on the continent. I wanted to understand why, if there's a conscious effort to why you decided to situate your research in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's a conscious effort for me, given sort of my birthplace. It's where I consider my home, and it's where I see that I can make a lot of good in terms of adding to the literature in where there are gaps, for example, in sickle cell disease. So I have made that conscious decision through my career, and also opportunities have came up, right, in terms of the ability to work with individuals that are already focused their work in Africa. So I have to say there are two things. It was a conscious decision from my part, but also being prepared and seeking out opportunities, and then opportunities availing themselves of me in terms of working and continuing to do some of my work, most of my work, I should say, in Africa. And I have just been blessed in that way. For sickle cell disease and obstetric hemorrhage and maternal health, I've added a U.S. component because, of course, there are over 100,000 individuals with sickle cell disease in the U.S., and we still have gaps in terms of the research. So I think that for me, just like you stated, from the African perspective, I think there's a lot that we can learn from Africa, and actually take that learning and apply some of those lessons to benefit populations in the United States in terms of disease. Most people think about global health as being from sort of high-income country and transferring that knowledge to low and middle-income country. I think that there is a benefit to that bi-directional communication in which you can take knowledge learned from Africa and African populations and benefit African ancestry and other populations, not only in the US, but around the world. I think that opportunity is wasted. And for me, it's been really a pleasure to sort of introduce people to that particular concept. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm moved to share that I'm actually working on a project now that's funded by the Center for AIDS Research here in the District of Columbia. And the project, as part of the project, we are adapting an intervention, a community-based intervention from Tanzania to work here in the DC area to provide PrEP at the community level for Black adults. So the concept of leveraging the evidence from Africa is also very much part of my work, and I'm excited to hear that you're also pursuing that path. Now, I know the PhD programs, regardless of what field you study, is not easy. And I know you were at an HBCU, which I assume helped to alleviate some of the difficulties of doing a PhD program. But nonetheless, I imagine you still had just the normal or maybe extra challenge that just come with doing a PhD. So if you don't mind sharing, of course, the joys of doing that PhD, but also what, if any, challenges you experienced and how did you overcome them?
Sure. I'm going to share a very personal story in terms of my PhD program. The PhD program at Meharry was there, and they were supportive. During my second/third year of my PhD program, my mother died of a car accident when she went back to Ghana. Her and my dad, they would visit Ghana annually and spend like maybe 6 weeks or so there in the summertime. So during that fateful visit, unfortunately, they were involved in a car accident and she passed. And that was one of the most challenging things in terms of my own personal life, because if you know anything about Ghanaian mothers, they tend to be the pillar of the house in terms of uniting and the family and everything else. And she was definitely my pillar, my light. If I ever had any issues, she would always be there. She could just look at me and tell sort of what issues I was going through. And she was a 100% supporter of me. And it's hard to lose a person that's so dear to you, that's like your 100% supporter, right? In terms of it, when you're going through an already intellectually intense part of your life, which is the PhD program. And that was quite devastating to me. Honestly, I wanted to quit the PhD program. And I tried to quit the PhD program. The folks at Meharry would not let me quit. They're like, no, you're a talented student. If you take some time out, but we're not going to let you quit. Dr. Dunya, who's also a Ghanaian, was there. He's like, look, we're not going to let you quit. You can take as much time you need, but we're not going to let you quit. So I took some time off. We had an enormous homegoing ceremony for my mother in Ghana, and made sure that things were situated as best as it can, and then came back to school. But even though when we had those funerals and everything else, it took me a long time to get over that, her passing. And I have never gotten over it, in terms of it, to say the least. The pain has decreased, but it's still a very singular event in my life that I would say at a very trying time in terms of the PhD program. And through my colleagues and my friends at Meharry and the support of the faculty, I was able to make it through. So I don't know if that was the answer you're expecting, but that's truly my particular journey.
And imagine it must have been very tough, and as you mentioned, still tough, in some shape or form, as you remember your mother, who was, and I'm sure is still, your pillar in one way or another. So thank you for sharing. I know this is not about me, but I couldn't help to also think, when I was doing my PhD, I'm originally from Haiti, and during the second semester, January 2010, the earthquake happened in Haiti. and so many individuals and loved ones, being killed all of a sudden. And I, of course, thought about taking time off, or, I mean, at that moment, in those moments, you're not sure what's best, but you need to take a break. And I'm glad that the support system you had at Meharry did not, let you quit, because we wouldn't be having this interview today, most likely, unless you went and did another PhD and, at some other institution. So wonderful success story in spite of the challenge, the personal loss that you had. And I'm sure, your mama would have wanted you to continue and support you. So.
And you're absolutely right in terms of it. And that personal loss was, I think, would have been compounded if I would have quit. And you're right, we would not be sitting here talking right now. But it has been something that has sort of, I turned that loss into a fire that burns inside my belly. And that's why, I think I've been able to push this far with her memory and making sure that, because I knew she was proud of me from undergraduate, in terms of it. So when I graduated undergrad, she was wearing my graduation robe and embarrassing me all around the house. So I knew she would have been just elated at the doctoral degree. So.
Thank you. Noah, do you want to?
Yeah, because from everything you've said, it's quite obvious that you had a bond with your mom, and she was a huge impact in your life. And that also speaks to the idea of family, amongst Black community, the sense of community, of collective, and how much we respect, people we look up to, and how much we also value advice and value the sense of belonging. You said earlier on that your mom was a nurse. I would just like to know if there was any part of our nursing practice, that influenced your decision or to study global health, or your decision to go into the health.
So it did influence my decision in terms of implementation research and trying to make sure that you increase adoption of evidence-based interventions in low and middle income countries. So she was obviously a nurse who loved her job, loved the people that she was working with, but at the same time, she also struggled in terms of trying to provide care for some of these individuals, in terms of it. So yes, that did influence sort of the pathway that I took in terms of my and also my thought process. Originally, a lot of my work was in bench in terms of characterization of African trypanosomiasis and their digenetic life cycle, et cetera, in the global health, sort of trying to characterize disease. But the more that I read about health services research, I became intrigued, and ultimately, that is what was the foundation for me shifting my focus from initial characterization to saying we really need to do something, and how do we get that done, and what are the best ways to drive up adoption in terms of in the global context, specifically in diseases that affect, African and African ancestry population. What can we learn from that? How can we benefit other populations in this context too?
Thank you. And I know a little bit about your work. If I'm correct, there's a nursing component to the work that you're doing with your recent grant. And I don't need to ask you about it now, but we'll get to it hopefully before the interview ends. I would like to now switch gear a bit and ask you to share a little bit about that transition from the PhD to eventually ending working at the National Institute of Health, which is the largest funders for research globally, I would like to believe. So Can you walk us through that, those next path after you come back, you finish your PhD, you graduate and transition to your postdoc, and then eventually the NIH?
Sure. So with the postdoc, I applied for a competitive fellowship within the first program, which is the Fellowships in Research and Science Teaching at Emory University. So not only was I a regular postdoc, I also taught class at Spelman and also Morehouse College, which was part of the Atlanta University College, which is also part of this very innovative program that was established by NIH. During my postdoctoral fellowship, I went to different conferences and I would meet people, and meeting people from the NIH was, I think, one of the benefits of those conferences. So I would just urge individuals that are in their early stage in their career to always go up to conferences and present their work. And at these conferences, just meeting other investigators, more senior individuals, and that was a great opportunity to share the work that I was doing. Eventually, one of those opportunities, one of those meetings happened to be an opportunity because the person was originally at another institution and then transitioned to NIH. And that was sort of the conduit that brought me to NIH. So it was a very short job interview that led to the offer to become a research fellow at the NIH. And from there, I transitioned to become a program official to learn more about sort of NIH, how they sort of fund work, because the research endeavor and the funding of the work are two separate engines within the National Institutes of Health. And once you understand sort of both, you get a fuller picture of the NIH in terms of what goes on. So I had the ability to understand sort of the machine in terms of how funding opportunities are produced. I wrote a few funding opportunities, came up with some programs in the global health space at a couple of institutes that I worked at the NIH, funded work in amongst a whole host of colleagues, including African colleagues, and was a significant advocate for early stage investigators. So I guess the take home message of this is that do not miss an opportunity to meet people when you're at conferences and engage with them, because again, you never know when that other opportunity will come up in terms of possible collaborations or even maybe a job offer down the line. But it's always good to put out as many feelers as you can and just be prepared sometimes, because those offers come in very unexpected ways, right?
Thank you. And then one question again before I transition to Noah is, a lot of people start a PhD program but may not actually know about postdoctoral opportunities and why they should pursue them, and maybe they'll learn about it along the way. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about when did you become interested in a postdoc and why, and then from there to kind of shed some light about that interest and transition to the postdoc.
Sure. So before going to graduate school, I was a teacher, a high school teacher in terms of science. So teaching was something that I always loved, was something that I wanted to do. A postdoc is what is normally needed in terms of better refinement of your research, and I providing you with an overall research identity other than what you've done in your dissertation, and also gives you more sets of skills as you move forward. In terms of thinking about the postdoc and also thinking about the postdoc transition and sort of the next steps in terms of it, I wanted a unique postdoctoral experience that would also balance sort of my research and my teaching experience. Many people just go for the research experience. The first program actually had a couple of individuals who graduated from Meharry who were fellows. So I reached out to them, had a conversation with them to see how they thought about it. And actually, they convinced me that it was a very good program. So I put in my application, and I was competitively awarded a postdoctoral fellowship at Emory. So I think for those people who are thinking about postdocs, they're not um, a one-size-fits-all postdoctoral fellowship. The first program allowed you to have your own independent funding outside of the lab, and then also have some money to do conferences, some equipment money, and stuff like that. It's called a mechanism. It's called a T32, I believe, if I'm correct. Might be messing that up, but because of that program, NIGMS, the National Institute of General Medical Science, has expanded that program, that sort of unique postdoctoral teaching program around the United States. So there are a lot more programs. I think when I was there was Emory and maybe three. North Carolina, UNC had one, and then a couple of other schools. But now I think there are more than 8 or 9 schools with that type of mechanism. So my encouragement to individuals is to try and figure out what are your interests, what types of skill sets you want, and then figure out whether the postdoctoral fellowship will get it for you. Because again, it's important in terms of your career moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Noah, please.
Yeah, my next question is personally important to me, and I also think it is also very useful for others too. So you've always been an academic, you taught before graduate school, you taught during graduate school, you taught during your postdoc fellowship, then you pivoted into research, I think, when you went to NIH. So how was that experience, that pivot, that transition from specifically academic into research into NIH? Was it like you're also back into academic now. So was it like there was a void, during that experience, during that period of working strictly as a researcher? Or was it just an experience you thought you needed to have,
So this is actually a great question. So what I have always done was sort of figure out, because teaching has been important to me, right? So even when I was at NIH, I was adjunct faculty at University of Maryland Global Campus and taught some classes there. So it was always trying to make sure that I hone my pedagogy and my skills in terms of teaching. So I think that for me, it is always important to understand that we can have the ability to do great research and also to be great teachers. So they are not mutually exclusive in that way. The transition, I think, back into academia was a little bit different, but it wasn't different in that too much in terms of sort of my daily activities. My teaching and my pedagogy was still there, but I think what the opportunity was that I now get the ability to think about not only writing papers, but also writing grants and reaching out to stakeholders to make sure that we are just working on very important questions that we can answer in terms of it. So I've come from sort of the funding side to sort of the more research and academic side. So, but those things have sort of been, again, sort of through my career. I never stopped publishing when I was at the NIH. I just published a little bit less. But again, I think you have to see a vision for yourself and what you want to do and sort of pursue that vision and have the opportunity there, right? Long as you don't stop in terms of doing X, Y, Z, in terms of what you see are important, and always adding as scientists something to the scientific literature, I think is very, very important. So
Thank you very much. The reason why I ask is because I want to teach. I love teaching. I'm teaching now, but I'm also considering working within, policymaking industry. And so I was just asking because it's still a very confusing to me for now, the decision to make. So I just thought it would be very helpful for others too who might need, that sort of advice, sort of just to hear someone share their experience. So thank you very much.
And I want to commend you in terms of teaching. I think teaching is important, and we need to engage the next generation in anything we do. So I commend you to keep on going in terms of teaching. And no matter, even if you're in industry, there's always ways to be adjunct in terms of, this school or that school to teach the courses that you're interested in. So I would encourage you to do that. So
thank you.
And yeah, and I think there are also ways to be in academia and still be engaged with the policy making industry that you're interested in. So I think there's ways to balance those interests over time. And of course, the more established you become in one or the other, then the more likely you are able to make that transition or to do both as a consultant or an adjunct, depending on which side you are on. So the National Institute of Health is made up of many institutes. So I would like you to share which institute you were working in, and then also the H3 project. I think you mentioned, if you could elaborate what it was. I believe it was a major project that you were very proud of. So if you could just give us a little bit of background. How long did it take you before you could decide to, launch this H3 project and so forth and so on, and the support you needed?
Sure. So remember my NIH days, the National Institutes of Health is composed of 27 centers and institutes, unless they've changed that number recently. So there's a lot of centers and institutes there in terms of it, and they do a whole host of work. Many are sort of divided into two main categories: general institutes, and then more institutes that are organ or disease focused, like the National Eye Institute is an organ-specific institute. The Heart, Lung, Blood Institute is more of an organ disease institute, etc. And then you have the National Institute for, I think, Minority Health and Health Disparities, or so. So there are several institutes there that have different missions, etc. For me, the institutes that I were at was the National Human Genome Research Institute, that's NHGRI, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institutes of Child Health and Human Development, the NIH Office of the Director, and also the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, which was my last institute, NHLBI, before I left. So those institutes have different missions. NHGRI, the Genome Institute, was where I started off working there in terms of working with Dr. Rotimi in terms of H3 Africa. So he allowed me to get on board at the ground level in terms of that concept development. And then it was sort of trying to work out sort of the details in terms of how we're going to launch this. And one of the ways we've decided to do it was, and this is all documented in the H3 Africa, which is the Human Heredity and Human Health and Heredity in Africa initiative. There's a white paper that I led as part of that whole effort to try and figure out what are the most pressing needs in terms of genomic research on the African continent, getting African investigators together. One of the main issues around at that point was that a lot of African investigators, even though they did the majority of the data collection, were not getting funded by NIH. They were not being as recognized for their contributions to this whole research endeavor. So H3 Africa was sort of the first attempt to make sure that African researchers were funded and obtain credit for what they were doing. And that sort of launched a lot of careers of individuals who were already doing marvelous work in Africa, but were not getting as much recognition in terms of it. So I think it was sort of, I would say, paradigm shifting and sort of thinking of it from a decolonization approach before the term decolonization came into vogue.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that detailed description. Noah, would you like to ask any questions?
So I would like to know more about your funding, your research, because you are based in the US. You are a professor at NYU, but your work is based in primarily in Sub-Saharan Africa. Where does the bulk of your research come from?
Sure. I just need 1 minute to answer the door real quick, okay? So my apologies.
No problem.
Sorry about that. That's living in New York sometimes. So
no problem. Welcome back.
So the question, if I recall, was about my research and also, is that correct?
Your funding.
My funding.
Current funding, at least.
Okay, so my current funding is on sickle cell disease, and it's on an evidence-based intervention to look at increasing provider adoption of hydroxyurea in Nigeria, and that's what we're doing. We've done a lot of work, preliminary work, looking at the issues around sort of why providers are not prescribing as much hydroxyurea as they should for sickle cell disease. And we have developed this sort of evidence-based intervention that is at the provider level, physicians, nurses, et cetera, that we think will help in terms of increasing the uptake of hydroxyurea within Nigeria. So that's the work that comes from NHLBI, National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute. They are the main funders for sickle cell disease research, and to a little bit of an extent, NIDDK, that's the National Institute of Digestive Diseases and Kidney. But NHLBI is the main funder for sickle cell disease work around the globe. So,
and this is the last institute you were at, the NIH, before you transitioned into academia, correct?
Correct.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, I would like to ask you then to share about your transition from the NIH or the NHLBI specifically to NYU. And many individuals may be interested in transitioning from working for the government to an academic position. And I know you said you were still publishing while you were at the NIH, so maybe you may have been better positioned than others who may not have a chance to publish. So maybe you can even share how many publications you had when you were leaving the NIH. And as I imagine that was taken into consideration for your position now, if you remember, and then how did you also convincingly, secure that position? Because I just think it's a little tougher for people to transition from non-academic positions to academic positions where you are expected to come in, with a research program, right? So what was your research program also that you were able to present, and so forth and so on? And I'll share, I remember when I was looking for my first tenure track position, and of course this is different from yours, but I was denied a position because even though I had the publications, but I was told because I did not have a grant from the National Institute of Health or did not have any experience writing NIH grants, I wouldn't be able to get the job, and I had to go look elsewhere. And then I learned how to write the grant. Of course, your situation was different. You were coming from the NIH and had been exposed to that, but I'm still curious, what were some maybe points that may be considered weaknesses that you had to be mindful of and address as well, if any?
So the school is 5 years old, right? And well, maybe 6 or 7, in terms of the School of Global Public Health. Public health schools are a little bit different from other academic schools, like schools of medicine, or in terms of it, because in public health, they focus a lot on practice. They also focus on teaching, because I teach classes in implementation science, etc. So I guess the first thing is you have to sort of know your audience in terms of it, right? In terms of where you're trying to apply. And my interest in sickle cell, obstetric hemorrhage, and all of these were due to sort of the previous work that I had done in terms of global health, etc. You're right in that many institutions want you to have a research program. I think that was not counted against me because I was coming from the National Institutes of Health. And when you're coming from a institution with a big name and a wide sort of recognition, I think sometimes people give you the benefit of the doubt, right, in terms of it. I can't say that would have necessarily been the same if I was just coming straight out of Meharry per se, so we have to be realistic in terms of this. However, the other important thing to advancing my career was, of course, all the networks that I had made while I was at NIH, while I was at Meharry, while I was also at Emory School of Medicine, in terms of it. And having those individuals to be credible partners in this endeavor. When you are trying to establish a research enterprise, you need people who will be willing to assist you, no questions asked, in terms of maybe data collection and all of these things. For the HIV work, I have some great collaborators in Nigeria, in Lagos, who where I asked them, I was like, well, in order for us to put in this grant, we really need some preliminary data collection. They're like, not a problem. We got that done. We've submitted that manuscript. So, and we have some preliminary data. So I guess I want to say that the strength of your network is important. The importance of your network is important when you decide to go to academia, because it's going to be this is not going to be a solo mission, right? And if you're going to be successful, you have to have collaborators, and they don't need to be at your institution, actually. And in many ways, it might be helpful that they're not at your institutions, because when you hit snags, you can always have somebody to talk to in terms of it. So developing that collaboration network starts in undergraduate, graduate school, and all through your career, in terms of just starting from day one and making sure that you hang on to that network, because it's important to have collaborative networks and then be able to utilize them when you need to. And that's key. So in terms of my ability to transition to where I'm at now, it was based on number one, my work at NIH, of course, plus the fact that I had some interesting and novel ideas that were not present in the literature at that time, and then the fact that the institution took a risk in terms of this. I took a risk too, because I gave up a position that had made the quote unquote a career appointment. So in terms of it, for another less position, and that is not career confirmed until you get tenure, and I'm going through that process right now. So I think it was risk on both individuals' parts, but understanding that I could meet those particular challenges based on my experience, and having the confidence to know that, I've done this before during my postdoc, during my research fellowship, etc., and having that particular confidence. But that confidence comes from talking to my colleagues and making sure that I have and my support system, and making sure that I am sort of thinking through these processes and thinking through this decision that I'm making, right? Because sometimes opportunities might occur and might happen, but they're not the right opportunities for you. And you have to be cognizant of that. Not every opportunity that emerges is actually right for you. And sometimes they can be a hindrance to your goal if you're not careful. So I just want people to understand that. But having a strong supportive network in which people will be honest with you and tell you this, and this, and is important in terms of it, and important in terms of your decision making. And I don't think we would all be here if we didn't have that system and that network that we've tapped into.
Thank you. Noah.
Thank you. Yeah. So you work on HIV and sickle cell in sub-Saharan Africa, and these are very touchy topics in that part of the continent. So I would like to know what sort of challenges and pushbacks you've encountered in terms of accessibility, in terms of data collection, in terms of even funding to an extent, and how have you overcome all of these challenges?
There are challenges, but I have some great partners who have worked. So I have to say first, I kudos to my partners, the University of Abuja, Dr. Obi Nudu, Oliver Ziche at NIMAR, the Nigerian Institute of Medical Research, Andre Kenge in South African Medical Research, SMRC, South African Medical Research Council, just to name a few. And there are other collaborators. So I don't want to, I know I'm missing a lot of people. So when I have my talks, I have a large slide with all the different collaborations. And you're right, there are pushbacks in terms of data collection and some of these issues there. But working with colleagues who understand and know the population that you're working with, because we know that African populations are very, very different depending on what country you're talking about, depending on what disease, what particular condition, etc. And so all of those things have to be accounted for when you're doing a lot of this work. Within global health work, there's no way you can do it without collaboration, and specifically individuals who are on the ground, who know exactly what they're doing, who are embedded within these communities and can be assistants. What I come from is I'm an implementation researcher. My general pitch is that I'm trying to figure out how we can improve conditions from these individuals. How do we drive adoption of an evidence-based intervention that has been shown to be effective, right? How do we get that? For sickle cell disease, my pitch is hydroxyurea. There have been the REACH trial and several of these other trials that show that hydroxyurea is acceptable and for African populations, and actually both adults and pediatric populations can benefit from the widespread implementation. So the question becomes, how do we get that widespread implementation? So I think it becomes an easier sell at that point. I'm not just trying to be there just to characterize a disease and then write some papers on it. What I'm trying to do is figure out how we can sustainably scale up an evidence-based interventions to help mitigate this condition and lead to more positive outcomes within these particular populations. I think that framework is important. And it's always important to share how populations will benefit from your research. It's easier for implementation and health services and interventional research. Some research, for example, genetics research, it's harder to make that case because it's an eventual on down the line benefit, right? If you contribute to this, we will understand these genetic variants. We'll do some more work in terms of pharmacokinetics to figure out what sort of drugs might be able to work on this condition. But that's a little bit more further on down the line, and sometimes can be abstract. What I do is I love it because it's not abstract. We basically know what the interventions are. We're trying to figure out how we scale them up, and we know if you scale them up, you'll have these type of positive outcomes, right? So that's sort of the way I approach my work, and getting my collaborators on board is number one, and then once that, I think everything else becomes a little bit easier. But you're right. There's nothing that's 100% easy when you're dealing with populations and some cases, very marginalized populations. So.
Thank you. Thank you. So we can now, I think, shift gear to academia a bit more in detail, thinking about your transition, your first year or two at NYU as a tenure track assistant professor, you balancing what I may imagine trying to get your grant written, papers published, and other activities, maybe transitioning to the city of New York, Manhattan, which is great. I don't know if you had teaching responsibilities during the first couple of years. So if you can maybe give us a picture of what first and second year was like for you at NYU on the tenure track.
Sure. It was hectic. All those things you pointed out was everything that I was doing. Writing grants, trying to do publications, teaching, and trying to figure out New York City in and of itself being a very large, loud, and robust city, right? And adapting to that sort of atmosphere. And then getting acquainted with a new institution, right? And that doesn't matter even if I would have went to, another, federal government job, just transitioning in and of itself is an issue, but transitioning to city and all of this were definitely chaotic in many ways. I put down some, I thought about it and I decided, number one, I would take things, not try and do everything all at once. So having been at NIH, I already sort of knew the composition of grants and had read, over probably 500 grants and could tell you what were the good grants versus bad grants, etc. I knew that I needed to work on my publications to support the grants that I was writing. So I got to work on that. My first year in transition, actually, my publications went down because, again, I had to focus on some of the stuff that I was doing. And, it takes maybe 2 years sometimes for a publication to come out. But it was important to understand that these things do take a long period of time. And then I had some great colleagues who had also transitioned. Ralph De Clemente, who came from Emory University School of Health, was the new chair for the social and behavioral sciences. So he was a great person to talk to in terms of it. So I reached out to some colleagues and had some great discussions with them. I understood that it would take a long time to get to that point in which I would probably get my first grant, and not being too frustrated by the process, but it can be a frustrating process, and just taking my time and being methodical in terms of it. I know that having been a program official, you have to submit the grant. The grant has to get reviewed. You see what the reviewers are thinking, and then you resubmit it based on the what they have said. Sometimes reviewers don't know what they're saying, but they always have some gut nuggets, right? And if there are areas in which you need to clarify, you clarify those areas. If they're and you again resubmit it, and having to understand it's a resubmission cycle, right? In terms of this, and going through that particular process, but at the same time also highlighting and making sure that that research is getting done, and those papers are being published, and they don't have to be, what is it, Nature or Science caliber papers, but they have to be good enough to pass peer review, and making sure that you're putting those out there in terms of it. And then also thinking about, so the first year I didn't start a lab. Actually, I had to get adjusted to NYU, had teaching responsibilities, had other responsibilities. But I started planning in terms of what type of lab I would want to set up. I looked at what was available within the school, or some significant and talented MPH students, which I could definitely benefit from. So when I finally decided to start my lab and figured out, what areas and how we would focus, I had some great MPH students work with me, start doing, number one, systematic reviews to, in terms of implementation, to gather the evidence for why we would utilize this sort of methodology or this sort of strategy or this sort of intervention in terms of it, laid the groundwork for that. Revised my grant based on the input that I got based on that. Again, mentored MPH students, because and we mentor about over 20 students in our lab, but they were an asset. Was able to take on a very talented doctoral student, Ph.D. student, Temi Ojo, who came to me and said, just because her mentor had transitioned to a different school, she needed a new one. So I was happy to assist her in terms of it, and just getting a lot of great help and support from the student and some of the faculties here within the School of Medicine also, and having that, but planning and being meticulous in terms of how was how I did this, and with the understanding that the old adage, Rome wasn't built overnight, right? And being patient, but that patient, I have to say, is frustrating. It is frustrating in many ways. But until you go through the process, you cannot appreciate. Dr. Conserve can definitely appreciate some of that. But with all of us, it's just you have to understand that sometimes you're going to write like 9 or 10 grants, and you might get one funded, and that's it. And having the tenacity to stick with that particular process, yeah. So that's basically it. It's hard for me to conceptualize it in sort of a one-liner, but I would say having that tenacity to stick with those things, but having a plan. What was my plan? My plan was I would be submitting a grant every single grant cycle for NIH, period. That was my grant. And then my other plan was I would submit 3 different grants at least for 3 different ideas, one on obstetric hemorrhage, one on sickle cell disease, and one on HIV/AIDS. Sickle cell disease was the first one that got funded. We're going to be resubmitting the HIV/AIDS one and the obstetric hemorrhage one, and then also wrote a grant for hypertension in Ghana in terms of looking at adolescents in terms of the increase in hypertension there. So putting those ideas on paper was very, very important. Finding time to put them on paper meant, every single Christmas I was writing, and all holidays I was writing the truth of the matter, the first 5 years, I didn't take a vacation. The first vacation I took was this past year. So it has been a singularly very intense journey, which I sort of compared to the PhD training in many ways. And to me, I think that if you can go through your PhD training and come out, that is sort of the fire that forges you in terms of your steady habits and your tenacity. And then you move forward with it. And then you have to understand that academia is one of those areas that fire will be tested again until you get to a certain point and you've established yourself, and that's it. There is no way to sugarcoat that, but you do need a support system. You need collaborators, and you can always find collaborators. And those things will be the most helpful in terms of your success, actually, because you're not going to be able to do it alone. That's the one thing I can vouch, and I think Dr. Conserve and anybody who has you've interviewed for this series would probably attest to. So,
thank you. That was phenomenal to hear. Not of course because you know I want you to I guess glamorize being under such pressure for the past few years, but to share the reality for individuals who are interested in potentially being on an academic path, whether it's in public health or another, another field. Those initial years can be very trying, and the more support you have in place coming in and collaborators, the better. But I also have experienced a lot of joy and freedom and authority in being, in academia, and that's one of the reasons I actually chose to become a professor, because when I was in undergrad, I did an internship in South Africa and then one in France. One was at the CDC type environment in France, and then one was at University of Cape Town working with one of the leaders in the HIV field, Dr. Linda Gail Becker, who is leading the Desmond Tutu HIV Foundation. And that experience, showed me the difference in terms of the liberty and the freedom she had as a PI to mentor me and had others, individuals. And I decided based on that experience compared to the one in France where I was in the office from 9 to 5, that I would go in academia because I would have freedom to do the work that I was interested in, but of course, be responsible for my own success and securing the grants and so forth and so on. So I would like you to share some of I hope you've experienced some joy and freedom and excitement in everything that you've been doing in spite of that intensity. And I could argue, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the reason you are putting in that amount of work is because of the joy and the passion and potentially the authority and freedom that you do have to do so. So before I pass it to Noah.
Sure, happy to talk about that. Yes, there are a lot of joys. One of the significant joys is mentorship. So I was able to mentor Dr. Tammy Ojo, my first student who graduated with her PhD. Phenomenal student from Nigeria in terms of it, just phenomenal person. And I have 2 more doctoral students in my lab now. That mentorship and also mentoring MPH students in terms of their transition to the workforce and helping them teach them. So that mentoring, I think, is a significant joy to see when you can talk to a student and that light bulb goes off when they understand the concept, right? And they understand sort of the power they have to make a difference in the world. So that is, I think, one of the significant joys in terms of this whole process. Second to that would be sort of the academic freedom to put in sort of commentaries, what your opinion is in terms of what you think is going on, right? And write that in a way that you feel is compelling and speaks to you as a person, and just talk openly about those particular issues that I think are relevant to you, and not only in research, right? Other areas that might be important in terms of maybe social science work and some of the injustices that are going on around the world, and even on campus, and being a champion for many of those things that you see are very, very important, right? And so those, I think, are two fundamentally important areas that are a joy in terms of being in academia. With this sort of privilege comes responsibilities, and I see that responsibility is in, at least from my perspective, the work that we do. We need to make sure that it is culturally appropriate and sensitive to the needs of the people that we need. And then the other thing is, I think, the mentorship aspect of it, right? And making sure we mentor individuals. And then the third thing is being an advocate for what we see are important, whether it's to other faculty members who might disagree with us, societies that we are part of in terms of bringing their attention to other areas that are probably underserved or underappreciated, but being an advocate and lending your voice to make sure that people who are above you in terms of authority understand that these are important areas that we need to address, in terms of it. You might not always be successful, but I think that it is an important to know that you are in that particular fight in many ways. You can't fight, and you can't fight every single issue, but I think it's important that you pick certain things that resonate with you, that you be a robust advocate for in terms of those. So to me, those are the things that are bring me joy. And you're right, Donaldson, in terms of thinking about all the hard work that I do, in terms of it. I one of the things I really love to do is to write letters of recommendation for my students. My students have received awards, are doing presentations. We've had a lot of students in my lab be first author on some of the papers, because I could have taken first authorship, but I was like, no, it's them. It's time for them to shine in terms of this, and sitting back. And in fact, some of my colleagues have criticized me for, not being first author on some of these papers that I could have been. And I just look at them and I say, well, that's not a fight I'm willing to have, because it's not important to me. Being senior author is important. Making sure that the student is first author. Of course, it was my idea. Of course, these are sort of things that I came up with. The credit is there in terms of it, but but it's sort of in some ways picking the fights that you want to have with your colleagues, other individuals, but to me, I think that being a great mentor is one of the sacred duties of being in academia. And there are just a lot of young individuals that want my experience. I've had good mentorship and bad mentorship. So bad mentorship could have totally derailed my career even before it started, to be honest with you. And I saw it derail a lot of people's careers, actually. So I tend to, I make sure 100%. I've learned from the good and the bad, and I know how to avoid the bad. And unfortunately, academia is full of a lot of bad mentors, So, so I have to say that my experience, going back to my experience in Meharry, I think that was foundational, because I received a lot of good mentorship, which was foundational for me moving forward. And then I also experienced a lot of bad mentorship in terms of it, and that is more common than not, right? So
Yes.
as individuals and people of color, we have to understand that most of our mentors are not going to look like us. We're lucky to meet a mentor that might be look like us, and then understanding that there are good mentors come in all shapes, colors, and sizes, and finding those that will be our advocates in terms of the work we do, I think, is important. So
I couldn't think of a better way to put it, Dr. Peprah. I'll just ask Noah if he has any questions, and if not, we thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I can just ask one more question, but I think you've spoken about this in your last talk, and it's how you've sort of imbricated your love of mentorship into both your personal and professional work, because I saw that you are the founder of Bakoye Foundation and co-founder of Washington Leaders Index, which are both platforms for emerging leaders and the next generation. So I don't know if there was a way you could talk briefly about, what you do there and the sort of mentorship you give.
So the sort of mentorship sort of underline my general philosophy that I'm developing, and as a lab, we're developing future leaders in the global health space, right? So the motto of my lab has been around leadership development and thinking about that, because at the end of the day, the individuals that are in your lab will one day be your peers, period. That there's no exception about it. So the people that are training with you will one day be your peers, whether they come to academia, whether they are in government, or whether they're in industry. People's paths take a myriad of ways. So you have to understand that, and you have to, as I sort of prefer to lead by example, that is sort of the way that I think about it. In terms of those particular projects, they fall along sort of the line in terms of my own mentorship and understanding that leadership development is sort of the quintessential ingredient in terms of anything that we do. As I've stated, I've had good mentors, I've had bad mentors, but mentorship is something that you can learn, right? Leadership is something that you can learn, just like writing a good grant. All of these are things that you can learn. There is no higher level sort of secret to all of these things, where some people might want you to think that there's a secret, but there's not. The Harvard Business Review publishes things on leadership, mentoring, networking, all of these things. So there is a lot of social science and work behind how you develop good leaders in terms of it. So that's sort of very important to me in terms of it, because the research that I do, again, as I've stated before, is all for nothing if we do not have individuals coming behind us who can march this forward. A person's lifestyle might be expectancy might be 70, 80, people are lucky 100 years or so. It takes people advancing that knowledge beyond their singular lifespan, which is basically a speck of sand on a beach, to really advance that work. So to me, I think our ultimate contribution to research is the legacy that we build in terms of mentoring others. And it's not necessarily in the work that we publish, because 100 years from now, nobody's going to cite my paper. All the papers that I have, nobody's going to cite it. Just like we don't cite papers 100 years ago, research has advanced, in terms of it. So the citation is not going to be, and it is not an essential part, but the training that you give to individuals who then train other people, who then train other people, in and of itself will bring to fruition the work that you're doing. And that's it. So I trust in people, because science will change. There are so many things we used to do 100 years ago that we don't do now. Science has evolved, especially evidence-based science, evidence-based medicine. But as long as I believe we mentor good individuals who are solid scientists, I think that's the best thing we can do in terms of this, in terms of the work. The work itself is no more is less important than the people who are able to carry that forward. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you making the time to share your journey and wisdom with us. And I hope everyone who's had a chance to watch this enjoyed it just as much as I did. And thank you to you, Noah, as well. I'm hoping you also found this interview very inspirational as you continue on your own PhD journey, and keep us posted as you make your next stride. So take care, Dr. Peprah. I will be in touch.